Hello everyone. So maybe let's start about Spring security. The objective of class will be understanding the authentication module in a Spring MVC application, authorization in a Spring MVC application, JUnit testing framework. These are the things we are going to cover in today's module. So I guess most of you guys have gone through the security part at least once in a life. I'm not sure whether you guys have implemented it or not. But if you guys have done any kind of a development, web-based application on that, so you must be aware of security part of it, right? That we need to implement. A Spring security module provides you the or gives you the option for all kind of a security, starting with a very small security for your small web application to the entire organization, to some layers, to multiple applications, or creating a complete network of security for the entire organization. So using Spring, you can implement any level of security you want. That is the robustness and that is the strength this module has. It's a very flexible and a very big module in terms of security implementation. So almost all kind of a security principles or problems you can get it resolved using these modules. The very basic things about security is about authentication and authorization. So the difference between authentication and authorization. So let's see that. There are three general principles of security: identification, authentication, and authorization. Identification means identifying a user based upon a certain identity. It can be a username, can be a token in case of cache servers, or a certificate in case of some tools. This is identification for any specific person or application. Now comes the authentication. The process of verifying the presented identity. In the case of username, it is a simple checking as the supplied password. So authentication is like you provide username and password while logging through your Gmail, through your Facebook account, or any other account. That is very basic level of authentication where you need to provide your username and a password. And on the basis of your username and password, you will get authenticated against certain security modules. That can be against database repository, that can be against LDAP, that can be against some service or something else. But at the end of the day, the thing is that you will be authenticated on the basis of your past username and password, which is stored somewhere in your repository in some format. Now comes the authorization. Authorization is the process of identifying the functionality an authenticated user is allowed to use. So for an example, you have provided the username and password to log into your application, maybe your company SAP, where you can see your profile, edit your profile, see all your accounts, employment details, and all those kind of things, right? So after logging in, you can access multiple modules. So whether you have a predefined roles or a permissions to access that module or not. So for an example, you can edit your profile, but you cannot edit someone else's profile. So that can be only done by the user admin, because admin usually have all the rights or the permissions or the roles. So this means that on the basis of authentication, you can authenticate it against the system and you can log in. But on the basis of authorization, you can have the access of different components of your web application. So you can restrict the access on the basis of authorization for the authenticated users on the basis of permissions, roles, or whatever you need to create. So it's a very prevalent security mechanism being used across IT landscape. So it's not specific to Spring or any other frameworks. It's across IT landscape, whether it is a system, whether it is a operating system, whether it is a application, web application. So we have these kind of a mechanism implemented almost everywhere. Authentication. So usually, I mean, this is a very basic level of authentication, which is very common, where you can provide your username and password and you can authenticate yourself. Authentication verifies you who you say you are. For an example, you are saying I am Edureka student and you have predefined or provided credentials which is provided by your organization. Maybe Edureka has provided you the credentials to log into your LMS, right? So that is the credential which is generated and provided by your application provider. And to use those credentials, you can have multiple options. So the very common option is login form. So it's a user interface for the users so that they can log in and they can start working on that. Apart from that, there are many other authentication methods like HTTP based authentications, HTTP digesters, using certificates for authentications, right? These certificates we commonly use in Tomcat, JBoss servers you have come across, right? For the configuration part of it. And then creating your own custom authentication method. So these are certain authentication methods which can be used for logging. So what is authentication in Spring Security? So let's start it from the scratch. Let's consider a standard authentication scenario that everyone is familiar with. A user is prompted to log in with a username and a password. The system successfully verifies that the user is correct for the username. The context information for that user is obtained. All the roles or permissions or all kind of a metadata which you want to associate with that particular users, you can have those information in your context. Then security context is established for that user, and that security context will hold all the users information which will travel till its sessions last. So when you log in, you have all the information loaded in the security context so that if you are accessing certain modules of the application can use those data for authorization purposes. So then user proceeds potentially to perform some operation which is potentially protected by an access control mechanism which may or may not be driven by the permissions or roles which you can design in your system, and using those permissions or roles you can control the workflow for your login user. So this way you can define which user can do what. So that is the use of Spring Security in web application. Now comes the Spring Security Authorization. Spring Security tackles securities from two angles: to secure web request and restrict access at the URL level. Spring Security uses servlet filters. Spring Security can also secure method invocations using Spring AOP with proxying objects and applying advice that ensures that the user has proper authority to invoke secured methods. We'll gradually see the level of security which can be used in Spring. So the very first level of security is securing your web request with the help of authorization authentication. Then securing your web request by restricting the access to the certain URL if you don't have that permissions. For all these things, Spring use servlet filters. That is very common technology we earlier use. I mean, in old days, we use filters only for the security implementation. Apart from Spring Security, also exploit the Spring AOP invocations. We're using interceptors, filters and interceptors, security interceptors, by securing your objects, methods, and all those kind of things. So authentication is always who you are. Authorization is all about what you can do once you are logged in. Authorization, it decides if you have a permission to access a resource or not. So that can be access controls for URLs, securing objects and methods on the basis of your permissions and roles, and having ACLs, which is access control list, so which is a part of your security context, and you can use that access control list to monitor your users process or users, what user is doing, which page is opening, or these kind of things you can monitor. So Spring Security is very vast, by the way, guys. Itself, like I said earlier, that I mean Spring Boot, Spring Root, Spring Security, Spring Batch. So these are all together a separate stream in Spring. Spring framework is mainly about your MVC, IOC, DI, context, these things. But if we say Spring Boot, Spring Root, Spring Batch, Security, these are very big frameworks. And as I said, using Spring Security jars, you can simply implement or you can simply develop a security layer for your web application. As easy as that. Apart from that, if you want to make a CAS client, CAS client is something, a big thing, which can be used as an umbrella for the entire organization. Even that can be developed through Spring Security. So it's vast. I mean, it's very flexible, it's robust, it's vast. It has all the security implementation or requirement for your organization or company or for your application. You can do that with the help of Spring Security. So now what are the different features we have in Spring? Web, which means web-based security. This Spring Web Security features provides Spring Security's filter-based web security support. So there is one filter class, Spring Security API, which can be used and which work as a filter for your application, web application, and using that you can implement the entire security for your application. So that is Spring Security web features. Then we have a Spring Security tag libraries, another jar, standalone customized jar to be used for security features for your applications. So Spring Tag Library includes a set of JSP tags for view level security. So what is view level security? I'm not sure whether you guys have gone through it. So for example, if you have any application and there is one profile page where you can log in and you can update your profile, like your maybe your address, maybe something else or something, right? But there are certain other things in your profile like privacy settings or something else, or maybe some permissions. So those permissions you cannot give to yourself. An admin can log in, access your profile, and can change your permissions using that edit profile page. So the thing is that the page you can access as a normal user, the same page can be accessed by admin as an admin user, but he will have a different view and you will have a different view. So two different users logging and accessing the same page, let's say edit profile page, but you are seeing that page differently with some options. But if admin is logging and accessing that page, he can see a different options. It can be implemented through Spring Tag libraries. You can invoke or revoke the components or the views on your JSP with the help of tag libraries. So something like that, one example I will say. If you see here, your tag libraries, security tags, these are security tags of Spring Tag libraries. You can say whether you have the access and you can secure that particular piece of code with the help of permissions and roles. If you have that access or permissions, you can see that, otherwise you cannot see that. So it's like implementing security on your view layer. That is done by Spring Tag libraries. Another libraries, or I would say jar, commonly used is Spring Core, which provides the essential Spring security libraries. There are some helper Java class, utility class, those kind of things are in Spring Core. And then in the configurations, we have all the XMLs related namespace configurations, which you can configure through Spring configuration jar. So these 3-4 jars are very common jars. Spring Tag libs, Spring Core, Spring Configuration, Spring Context. These are very common security jar files which needs to be in your class path if you are going to implement security. Now, LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. So very common example, if you are working for some company, you must have some portal or website internal to your employees, right? There must be some portal or website which is internal for employees, and then usually like people like us who is having software background or IT background, we have to work on some desktop or laptop connected through your intranet or some internal network of your company, right? We use same username and password to access those portals, and we use same username and password to access your machine or some other internal applications, maybe your timesheet, maybe your profiles. So those are the things which is driven through LDAP. If you have to access your Outlook, if you have to access your IM, Internet Messenger, if you have to access your portal or website, right? We use lightweight directory access protocol to access active directories. For an example, if you have a requirement inside your company where you need to develop an application, so what you need to do, you need to have some sort of a repository, and if you need to have some sort of login features, login logout features, then you would like to use repositories, right? Those LDAP. So for an example, how to use LDAP or AD, Active Directories. For an example, you are going to develop the application or the security layer for that. In case, what is your say? So you have to develop that application for your internal employees. That application will have the login logout feature. So what you will suggest, you are going to create a database, and where you would like new table for username and password and all, then you implement it. Or you would like to use already created repository, which is AD, Active Directories, and you can access that Active Directory through LDAP protocol, and you can use those protocols for the authentication purpose, which is already there. So authentication mechanism is already there. You would like to reuse it, or you would like to create a new one. So it happens a lot. I guess 3-4 years back, while working for one of the client, we got the same kind of a requirement. The requirement is that to develop an application and utilize the LDAP. So we have used the LDAP feature rather than, we integrate our application with the Spring Security and LDAP integration, and we have provided the feature. So all the authentication is done through LDAP. On top of that, we have done the authentication against LDAP, but using that authentication, we have given the SSO feature to the client, single sign-on. So for an example, if you are accessing abc.com for your company, you need to sign once. Then you are accessing abc2.com from the same client, you don't need to sign in. So again, that is single sign-on features, and so on. So that is single sign-on feature where you need not to sign it twice for accessing multiple application for the same client. So that is single sign-on feature, which is sitting on top of your LDAP authentication. So these two are different. So authentication is happening with the help of LDAP protocol, but using that, you are giving the single sign-on feature to your end user. Very common single sign-on feature is we commonly use with Google, right? If you are logged to your Gmail, you need not to log into your Picasa or Google Plus or any other Google Cloud or related application, right? So that is single sign-on feature. But how they are doing the authentication, we don't know. Maybe they are using some SSO. Obviously, SSO is there. They are providing the feature. But how they are doing it, LDAP? No, LDAP is not there. We are not, So maybe they are using some other sort of security or authentication mechanism. Then we have ACL, that is Access Control List. Using Access Control List, you can provide the support for domain object security, which means you can have the access control list ready with each of the users, and then you can provide the domain object level security, like whether you can access the user DAO object or not, whether you can access the account DAO object or not. If you have that access in your access control list, then only you can access the object. So that is object level security based on ACL. You have a list of permissions. Let's say I logged in as a user, Farhan. My access control list, I have permission 1, P1, P2, P3, and P1, P2, P3 having permission, those I can access only one domain object or two domain object. It's like that. If I try to access any other domain object, in that case I will get the unauthorized exception or permission level exception. So these are the things which is very commonly used in banking, finance and health, these kind of domains where we have a very secure transactions. So we use these kind of a security there only. Otherwise, in normal web applications, interacting with normal users, we don't need that. We just need the 1 or 2 level of security. That's it. So if we have banking, telecom, or those kind of applications where we have put transactions in money is involved, or those kind of things are involved, we need different level of security, maybe object level security, method level security, and more. Then we have a CAS client. So what is CAS client? By the way, Spring Security provides the integration for CAS client as well with the help of JASIC Central Authentication Services. JASIC is another Java API for security integration, very standard API, part of J2EE. So using that, you can create your Central Authentication Service. And nowadays it is very common. Almost all the organizations are using. So how do you think that if you log into Gmail, how you are getting authenticated? Or if you're logging to Gmail, then again you are going to log into Google Plus or maybe some other application, Google Cloud or Picasa or some other application, right? So how do you think it is happening? So the application, the authentication is not happening for your Google, Gmail, Google Plus. We have a different application, right? We have Gmail, another application one. We have Google Cloud, we have Google Plus, different applications. So do you think that Google is implementing security for all these applications separately? So if you have single organization and you have multiple applications and more or less you have a same set of users, so you don't want to redo the things, right? That you are implementing security for application 1, A1, A2, A3 differently, right? So what you do, if your applications are getting, if your organization is getting bigger, having multiple applications, what you do, you will create a security layer or application itself or a service itself. So that is central authentication service. A small application with the help of Spring Security, you can create a small application which you can deploy on some server, maybe Tomcat, maybe JBoss as an application service. So that works as a central authentication service for your entire organization. So whosoever needs to integrate or call for authentication simply needs to call this service with some token, which is the conversion of your username and password. So whatever, right? You just need to call this service. The service task is to authenticate you and send back a response that user is authenticated. So once you are authenticated, again your cache service through Gmail, then when you log in through Google Plus and try to access the same thing, let's say Google Plus, so it will again call it, but it will pick the token or that alphanumeric keys, so J session ID, and using that session ID hits the cache service again. So what cache service does, it simply see that the user is already authenticated and that key is already there in the session or the memory. So it will simply send back the response that user is already authenticated and it will open the page for you. So there is no need to go through the login form again. So that is how it works. So if you see here, we have a different applications running here. One web application, maybe Spring MVC application, maybe Spring application with the help of mobile, that is Android application, maybe REST services or web services you have created for some other client or some JMS application is running on this. So 4 set of applications are running which needs authentication. So what you did, you have created one application and deployed on cache server. Cache server can be Spring Security, JASIC APIs and Tomcat. These are the combination your cache servers will have. HTTPS request will flow with the help of tokens. You can make it centralized authentication service. So once you are logged in, you can share that session with other application. So this way you can give the single sign-on features to your end user with the help of cache services. It also reduces your line of code. It also reduces your configurations and your work or your effort to have one single thing at one place. So if you guys are aware of, we discuss about cross-cutting concerns, right? And we discussed that, security authentication is also one of the cross-cutting concerns. So in one application, what we used to do, we create interceptor, right, for the application, so that all the incoming requests will go through that interceptor. So in cache case, you can say we have created the interceptor in a bigger way. So this cache server is working as an interceptor for all the requests for all the applications. So if whenever there is a request hit in terms of login page, that request will go through this interceptor, that is cache. When things become big or enterprise level, we used to devise some way where we can utilize these things. So these are the things we used to implement in a big organization where we have a multiple applications running, and it is quite widely used nowadays. Now the last one is OpenID. You guys come across, like, if you are going to visit some new site, maybe it can be your e-commerce site or maybe it can be social media, some new social media site. You usually get an option, if you are visiting first time, you're getting an option of sign up, right, where you need to provide all the details for username, password and create your user, right? But what is happening nowadays? Nowadays, apart from giving you an option of sign up, they also give you an option of, you can use Google sign-in feature. You can use Facebook, you can use LinkedIn, you can use Twitter, YouTube, right? Without, going through the sign-up thing. That is known as OpenID. So for an example, you are new to the market, you are developing an applications, you don't have enough infrastructure or maybe resources. So what you are going to do, you are going to buy some security features from Google. Maybe you are not even giving you an end user an options to sign up. You are simply using, with the help of OpenID integrations in your application, you are using Google and Facebook. So any user having Google and Facebook option can log into your application. So you have some kind of a tie-up with Google or Facebook. So that is OpenID integration. So Spring Security provide you this feature as well. So if you want to integrate with OpenID, maybe it can be Google, maybe it can be Facebook, LinkedIn, or any other giant, you can use the integration with the help of these OpenID, decentralized OpenID. So rather than worrying about creating the security features for your application, you simply authenticate the user with the help of decentralized OpenID standards, which is in market nowadays. Web-based security. How to implement a security in your application. Very first thing, very basic Spring Security setup. You need to add Spring Security dependencies, some jars, 3 or 4 jars, depending on your requirements. You have to update your web XML. Why we need to update a web XML, by the way, in Spring Security? We need to update web XML for filters. We need to add a filters so that we can filter a request for security. Then we need to create a Spring Security configuration. That is another XML file which will only hold or handle the Spring beans for your security features. Very 3 basic steps: add jar files, update your web XML, create XML file for your Spring Security configurations. And then you can keep adding the configurations, writing the code. If you want to customize it, you can do that. So what is filter? Filter is nothing specific to Spring application. It's a J2EE concept. Filter dynamically intercepts the requests and responses, incoming request and outgoing responses, to transform or use the information contained in the request or response. So if you want to play around with the request before it goes to the controller or your business, you can intercept the request with the help of filter. Then you can intercept your response before it goes to the end user with the help of JSP engine and all. You can intercept that response and you can apply changes whatever you want. So that is the use of filter. Filter can perform many different types of functions. Logging and audit tracking users of web applications, which we have discussed earlier as well. If you need to implement some login for the request, you want to wrap your request, each incoming request, with certain methods or certain messages, you can use this place, filter. Or if you want to audit tracking your users for your web applications, so if you want to audit how user is behaving, how user is accessing your applications, so the place we need to implement those business things is filter. So if you want to create, or if you want to drive out the patterns of the users, it usually happens in social media sites or e-commerce sites. You track the pattern of the users. So for an example, some users logged in and just simply goes to this page, page number X or Y, or maybe directly search it, use the search. So using these filters, you can track the behavior, and you can track this behavior, retrieve the informations, and you can persist in database so that you can put some business logic or analytics on top of it, and you can generate some business informations or reports using those informations, that what is the behavior of your users, how they are marketing, how they are shopping online. So these things we can do at the level of filters. Then we have second is authentication blocking based on user identity. You have filter all the requests going through that. You simply block the request if the user is not identified and simply display the page, whichever page you want. Third one is data compression, making downloads smaller. If the request is for download, you can compress the data at this filter level so that the download will become smaller. The file will become smaller, so the smaller file is better to handle. Maybe you can use zip, unzip kind of a things you can use in these filters, which is very common, which we used to do earlier as well. So that is more or less we do with filters. So this is how your XML looks like if we use filter. We need to provide the filter, and the class is delegating filter proxy class, which we needs to define, and we need to define the URL pattern. If you want all the URL goes through this delegating filter proxy, you can say /star, or if you want to skip some of the static pages out of the authentication, you can simply skip it. So usually it happens, for an example, your site is, let's say, HTTP, and your site starts with the, let's say, my app, something like this, and then the pages. But there are some static pages which you don't want to be authenticated. Anyone can access it. Let's say contact us.jsp. So this way you can say about us or help. So these are things you can escape. And in the filter URL pattern, you can say this, my app star. So all the requests under my app will need authentication. Rest don't need any authentication. This way you can filter it out on even your web XML page if you want. So this filter works as a hook which gives an entry to your Spring Security web infrastructure, and this will take you to use the multiple options we have in Spring Security. In this case, the bean here is named as a Spring Security filter chain, which is internal infrastructure bean created by the namespace to handle web security. So if it is saying a Spring Security filter chain, then we need to say Spring Security filter chain because it is directly mapped with your filter proxy class. So that is the first step we need to do in WebXML. So let me create a project for you from scratch, a new project. Let's say Spring Security Demo 26th November MVC project. Next o.edureka.spring security app. Say finish. Structure is created. It's updating the dependency. Let me change the library to the correct one. I have a project created which I did earlier as well in Spring MVC. What should be the next step here? Skeleton is created. So let's add the dependency. So I'm removing it first, then adding a dependency. Then the security files. If you can see here, we have different security libraries here. Security ACL, config, code, taglibs, web. So I need right now this config, taglibs, core. I guess core is already there. Taglibs, then web. So dependencies are done. What should be the next step now? Added the dependency, web XML, source. I have everything here, but I need filter. Let's add a filter, display name, filter class. So let's see that Spring Security filter chain. Then we need delegating filter proxy class, which is this. Copy paste it here. Dot. So that's what I was saying. If you see here, it's extending generic filter bean. If you see here, generic filter bean is further implementing this filter class, filter interface. This filter interface is what I was telling you guys. It's the part of JavaX servlet. So ultimately, everyone is using the filter only, which we used 10 years back or 15 years back. But they are giving you more options on top of it. I have a filter here. Then I should have filter mapping, filter name, URL pattern. I'll say star. So I have filter and filter mapping ready. So my configurations done. So now WebXML part is done. What I need to do now? I need to create one configuration file for security. So wherever you want, you can create. I am creating this inside app servlet. Let's say Spring bean configuration. Next, I'll say security.xml. I'll say next. I'll say beans. I'll use this. I'll say next. I'll say finish. So I have this bean ready. So this security XML is ready, but something is missing in this security.xml. So I need to add context, namespaces. Remember that we have a different namespaces for different things in Spring, like AOP, like context, JDBC, JE. Then we have security here. So here is security. So save it. So this way you will get another tab here, security. So we are done. I have a file here. I have web XML, I have security XML, and some servlet context XML, root context XML. Everything is here in that, right? Some other XMLs as well. Very main thing is missing now. Something else we need to do in web XML. We need to add another root context here. Now let's move and see. So configuration is done. Let's see what's next. So most of the thing, if you need to implement your security, very basic level of security with the help of database or something, you don't need to write a single piece of code. That is the beauty of Spring Security. How? Let me show you. So I have a security XML here. Either you can write it here or you can go and right click and see the options. The first thing is that insert security HTTP element. So I have inserted security HTTP element and I said auto config true. As soon as I said auto config true, I don't need to do anything else. In the source, if you see here, auto config true is set. If you set auto config true, which means it will provide the security for your application automatically, and even you don't need to write a code for it. Even the JSP page is provided by the jar file. So if you open your Spring Security demo, this project in your view, you won't even see a login.jsp here. The JSP itself will be provided by the framework. But yes, you can customize it, you can extend it, you can change it, you can have your own JSP page, by the way. But that is the strength of Spring Security. You don't need to write a JSP itself. Now, next thing you need to add, I have HTTP security configured automatically here. Now, what I need to do? What should be the authentication manager? How you are going to authenticate user? So you should have some manager, right? So there is one authentication manager here, I guess. Insert security authentication manager. Now what you can do, you can right click on authentication manager. You need to add a provider. You can have one or more than one provider, but here I am adding authentication provider here, which is customized one. If you want to have authentication provider LDAP, you can have LDAP authentication provider. So you can have your configuration here and you can inject the LDAP authentication provider here. But here I am using a default one, that is authentication provider. In this authentication provider, I need to provide a service. Which kind of a service I am going to use for authentication? Whether it is a JDBC user service, which is a database, whether it is a LDAP user service, which is LDAP authentication, whether it is a password encoder or normal user service you want to provide. So you say normal user service. So this normal user service can have one or more than one user. You can consume some services here as well, or you can also create some inline users like this. You have this, you say username, let's say Edureka. You can say password, you have Edureka, and you can say authorities role underscore user. Let's say authorities is this. So if you open your source now, you will see your authentication manager is created, provider is there, your provider is your user service, and this user service is nothing but inline user which is provided by you in your XML configuration. Or maybe you can say some anonymous users who have some basic rights, and using anonymous users you can log in to your application and you can see how it is working. Some of the basic flow you can use. So having said that, let's start this application. Add, remove, finish. So if you see here, I have not written a single piece of code. No controller, no JSP, no service, nothing. Right click, start. Only configuration, some XML configuration, that's it. So it's done. Spring Security app. Let's say that. So this is your home page. If you want to access your login page, you can go here and say login. So if you see, this page is automatically created or provided by your Spring Security framework. So if you use Edureka password here and if you pass some wrong information, you will get exception. Your login attempt was not successful, try again, reason bad credentials. So everything is auto configured. I have not written a single piece of code for this. So if you write the correct information now, then you can log in. See how easy your Spring giving you for the developer community. You can easily implement the security with the help of these. Now, how to intercept incoming URLs? Intercepting incoming URLs. So if you see here, we are using the same configuration what we use here, security HTTP. Then we provide use expressions true. When we say use expression true, then we can use the expression of tag libraries which is provided by the Spring API, Spring Security API, like deny all, permit all, these kind of keywords we can use. So this above XML configuration will intercept all the URLs and deny the access to the pages for your application. So if you see anyone tries to access your application, it will get the deny all page. So now to permit the user access to any other page, we can insert another security intercept URL. Let's say intercept URL home permit all. So using pattern and access keywords, we can prohibit the user to access certain URL. So for an example, if we see how to use these things like this. So let's say what is URL based security. Let's say I have this URL myapp.com user business account, and you can access this URL directly by logging in and having role user as a permission. Now I logged in as a normal user. What if I copy paste, I get hold of this URL, let's say admin URL. I try to open this in new page, let's say new tab. Because with the help of these Spring Security pattern and access level, we can prohibit that admin URL should always be accessed by the user having role admin. So this we can mention here in configuration file here. I'll say pattern star admin star and access is equal to, let's say, role admin. This way we can restrict the access to certain URL which we don't want to be get accessed without some special permissions. This way we can also implement the URL based security. So this particular configuration will says that we want all URLs within our application to be secured and require the role users to access all the URLs in your application. So this way, without writing a single piece of code, you can secure your website and you can implement URL based security. This HTTP element is the parent for all web related namespace functionality. And the intercept URL elements defines a pattern which is matched against the URLs of incoming requests. You can also use regular expression matching as an alternative, like star, dot star, these kind of things you can use in your pattern. Here the access attributes defines the access requirements for requests. For an example, role user, role admin, or some keyword like permit all, deny all, these kind of. HTTP auto config attribute, which we have used. Using auto configurations, true gives our application a free login page, support for HTTP based authentication, and support for logging out. So these are options we can get if we use auto config true. So in fact, setting auto config is equal to true is equivalent to explicitly asking for the features like normal form, HTTP basic authentications, logout, and intercept URL feature. So you are getting all these in one. Now security with Spring expressions. To enable it, we must set the use expression attribute of HTTP to true, like HTTP auto config true, and use expression is equal to true. So to require role admin access for the admin URL pattern, you simply use that autoconfig true use expression and then pattern, and you can have the method as well. Let's say has role admin. So these are has role method. These are expression which is evaluates to true if the current user has been granted the given authority. So these keywords, these tokens like pattern access, these are part of your Spring security jars. We just need to know those configuration. That's it. Now there is also, we can drive the type of protocol. So HTTP HTTPS protocol. If your application supports both the kind of a protocol, let's say HTTP HTTPS both. For an example, for static pages you are using, let's say, HTTP protocol. Contact us, about us, on all these kind of pages. And for some secured pages you are using HTTPS. Let's say admin pages, maybe security pages, right? And in that case you require that particular URLs can only be accessed over some specific protocol. So for an example, all the admin URL, all the secure URL, all the URL ending with secure or ending with admin, you want those URL to be only accessed through secured protocol, that is HTTPS, and you want those URLs to be accessed by some, let's say, role admin. You can configure it using pattern, access, and requires channel attribute. So requires channel attributes can take parameters as HTTP, HTTPS, or any. So this way you can add another level of security on your application, where you can explicitly mention in your configuration file that certain pages or certain URLs can only be accessed over your secured HTTP protocol, that is HTTPS. So you need not to write any piece of code for that. You just need one single configuration line in your XML and you can filter it out. So if any user try to access the secure URL on only HTTP protocol, it will get the proper error message from the Spring Security Framework. So in this configuration, if user try to attempt or try to access anything matching with secure using HTTP, you will be redirected to the HTTPS URL. They cannot use the HTTP URL. So the available options for required channels can be HTTP, HTTPS, or any. When we use any, which means either you can use HTTP or HTTPS. It will work for both. The use of requires channel, pattern, access, these are very widely used things which we need to know in a Spring Security configuration. Adding some users in security.xmls. So we can add some users under your user service directly in the form of anonymous users which you want to use for some guest or some anonymous user, and you can provide the lowest level of authorities to those users so that they can access few pages for your applications. In those cases, you can use some inline users in your configuration files. So using a user attribute, we can define any number of users with their passwords and roles within the application. It is also possible to load users information from standard properties file using the properties attributes on user service. There is a question from Annie. Which security expression evaluates to true if the user has been granted the specified role? We have seen that example earlier, right? Remember, it's evaluate to true. This should be a method, that is C, has role. Security in view layer, which we have seen earlier as well in the form of JSP. Spring Security supports security in the view layer with the help of provided tag libraries in your jars. How to use that? With the help of 3 tags, Spring Security Access Control List, Security Authentication, and Security Authorize, we can implement view layer security with these tags. And they have different way of doing it, but the intention is same, to secure your view. So access control list allows the body of the tag to be rendered if the currently authenticated user has one of the stipulated permissions in the specified domain object. So if the authenticated user, logged in user, having the permissions which is required to access that particular domain object, and that permission is part of that access control list, then those part will be visible or available for the user to access. Security authentication. Security authentication accesses properties of the current user's authentication object directly. I mean, if you have your authentication object created and it is available in the context, you can directly access that, the properties of authentication object, and you can cross check against that whether the user has the specified permission or not. Then we have security : authorize. It allows the body of the tag to be rendered if the specified security constraint has been met. That constraint can be populated in your controller or your Java layer, and then you can use that constraint on the page. So to use these JSP tag libraries, we'll need to declare it in the JSP files on top of it, like we used to do for form tags or any other Spring set tags like this. We can use authorize if any granted, and then we can access the permission, whether user has role admin permission or not, or any string, internal, external, or administrator or something like that. This way we can secure the JSP page. Authenticating users. Spring Security is prepared to cover many common authentication scenarios, including authenticating users against in-memory user repositories, that is Spring configured, which is something like this. This is your in-memory user repository where you can extract this user repository. Let's say you can move this repository from here, let's say this, you can cut it, you can use it somewhere here, let's say like this. You can provide the ID here, security, in mem security. So you can use this here as a ref. You can use it like this. This is work as in-memory user service. You can extend it as well. Now, if you want to replace it, you can replace it some security service which is working against your database as well. So that is in-memory user repositories. Then you can use JDBC based user repositories as well. You create your user repository with the help of Spring JDBC API and you can use that repository here. Then LDAP based user repository, you can create a code, you can configure LDAP with the help of configuration and coding, and then use that repository directly and inject it here in the configuration file. And the authentication provider will become your LDAP based security. Similarly, you can have OpenID decentralized user identity systems where you can use this again in the configuration file, CAS X5.09 certificate and JAS based providers. The difference only is that all these repository will behave like a Spring Bean. It will behave as a Spring Bean. You can inject any Spring Bean here as a security authentication provider, whether it is in memory, whether it is JDBC based, LDAP or whatever. So as long as that repository is part of your Spring Bean configurations, Spring container, you can inject that dependency directly in your Spring security configuration file and you can use that. So for now, we are using these user. If you use this security against the database, you can use JDBC and you can directly inject that in your provider. And then you can directly test that against your database. Something like this. So configuring an in-memory repository is simply extract that user service, provide the ID, provide the user separately, and then using authentication provider and user service ref, you can integrate that to your provider. And then authentication manager element registers an authentication manager. More specifically, it registers an instance of a provider manager. And provider can be your in-memory database or LDAP or any other. Now, authenticating against a database, that is JDBC user service. So the JDBC user service elements uses a JDBC data source wired in through its data source ref attribute to query a database to user details. So the attributes of JDBC user service that can change the SQL used to query for user details. So for an example, users by username query, authorities by username query, queries for a user's granted authorities. These three queries we can use to get the username, password, authorities and group authorities. First query will load the users and it's verify the users against the username and password. Second query will load all the authorities specified for that user. And third query will load the group authorities by the username. Thanks.